Hello again, welcome back to AP World. This is chapter 3 of Unit 7. This is a new video, as you can tell by the color scheme and by the bell work right here. So if you're or while you're watching this during class today, be nice to our lovely substitute. While you're watching this during class today, take like 5 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, to just write down your bell work for this. So pause the video, take like 5 minutes or so, and then write down your answers. I'm not going to pause myself because I want to get through the lecture. So, in this chapter, we are going to take a look at the Paris Peace Conference, and Claude is right here, right next to me. The Paris Peace Conference is the series of treaties that are going to end World War I, set up some post-war cooperation between the Allies, at least in theory, and then also um, kind of, well, set the stage for the rest of the 20th century, at least in theory. It's supposed to kind of prevent future international crises from happening. That's the lesson objective right there. Paris Peace Conference. Now, like I just said in our little intro, it's a series of peace arrangements between the Allies and the Central Powers, largely to end the conflict, but also think about the post-war world, kind of reorganizing things based on principles like self-determination, based on things like open diplomacy with the League of Nations, for example. Now, the kind of major leaders that are going to be there are the big three, aka the allies of World War One. Now, there's technically four. There's the Prime Minister of Italy, but he doesn't matter for our purposes. Who does matter are these guys right here. You only really need to know one of them by name, and it's Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. He's going to be partnered and working with primarily Georges Clemenceau from France. He's the sort of kind of president-ish, but more like a military dictator. And then David Lloyd George. He's going to be the prime minister from the UK. Now, even though these big three worked together in World War One, Wilson eventually, obviously, led the United States into World War One. We do see that the big three are divided as to what exactly this peace will look like. Now, Wilson, we've kind of defined him already. The United States under Woodrow Wilson kind of saw World War One as an opportunity to end all wars ever, basically. It is the biggest war of all time so far in world history, especially in the industrial age. So, Wilson thinks it's a unique opportunity to bring about international lasting peace. And kind of the way that we do that is by kind of promoting democratic idealism. Idealism is like the perfect, ideal situation sort of thing. Now, in Wilson's mind, the best way to prevent another war is by the big three adopting the principles of the 14 points into the actual peace treaties, into the agreements that are set out between the Allies and the Central Powers. Now, the 14 points, you need to sort of memorize those, so make sure that you're looking over those, but they include things like open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, disarmament. They include freedom of the seas, disarmament. No, League of Nations, freedom of the seas, disarmament, open diplomacy, and self-determination. There we go. Now, those are all important. But kind of, I guess you can sum up Woodrow Wilson, his attitude, especially towards the Central Powers, is that he wants there to be peace without victory. And in other words, what that means is that we should end the conflict, but have no one kind of gloat, basically, that they won. We can't have this victimization of the defeated powers. Everybody wants the war to end, right? We should have peace without actually kind of subjugating the Central Powers. Now, this is going to be very contrasted with what the British and the French want out of this war. And kind of it makes sense why the British and the French are a bit more revengey. For one thing, they've kind of been at it, so to say, with the Germans for quite some time throughout the late 19th and definitely into the early 20th century. The British and the French also suffered more casualties from World War One, so they kind of used the opportunity of the Paris Peace Conference to exert some nationalist revenge against their, almost said heated rival, against their enemy. But they also kind of think that there are things that they need to do to secure their national security against a potential German threat in the future. For one thing, kind of the British and the French are going to sort of place the blame of the war on Germany. Germany was the primary aggressor in their opinion. And the reason why they think that is, well, who was killing most of their boys? It was the Germans. Now, in kind of compensation for all of these dead soldiers, this is where we're going to see the British and French demand for the Germans to pay reparations. Now, reparations we've already sort of established in a previous chapter, in our chapter about the causes of World War I, but reparations essentially financial compensation for the death of soldiers, especially after World War I, but we'll see a similar thing happen after World War II. But the sort of British and the French policy during this Paris Peace Conference is going to be one of making sure that there is guarantees that Germany will never, ever, ever be able to attack the British and the French ever again. So, kind of having this idea of national security is another part of what the British and the French want out of the Paris Peace Conference. One way that we have this guarantee of national security is going to be by establishing a buffer between places like France and places like Germany. Now, in particular, kind of what the French want, and the British support this as well, is the creation of this area in red on the map down here. This is an area known as the Rhineland. Basically, it's the area around the Rhine River, which is the traditional border between the French and the Germans. Now, what we're going to make this Rhineland is a DMZ, aka a demilitarized zone. Basically, we're going to have an area where nobody is allowed to station their troops. Least of all, no Germans are allowed to station their troops. But finally, speaking of the Germans, the British and the French also believed in having severe restrictions on the size and scale of the German military, reduce the arms of the Germans only. Woodrow Wilson said everybody on Earth should disarm. The British and the French are saying, nah, only the Germans. Now, these two kind of ideas are going to conflict against each other. The idealism of Woodrow Wilson in the United States and kind of the more national security revenge concerns of the British and the French, and kind of some compromises are made. Honestly, the only thing Woodrow Wilson actually gets accomplished for himself is the League of Nations. And kind of the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson is feeling that he could compromise on everything except the League. The League of Nations, according to Wilson, is the best way to prevent any future conflict from happening. We have some sort of set area for all nations to handle out their disagreements with each other. We do see that kind of a national security idea that is implemented, at least in theory, by the Paris Peace Conference, is actually a defensive alliance between the big allies, between the British, between the French, between the United States of America. If there ever was a war in the future, all three of these powers would come to each other's aid. And kind of, they also are going to see that we're not going to have a blanket treaty for all the Central Powers. We have separate ones for the individual ones, namely for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottomans, and the Germans, which is the one we're going to focus on the most. Now, these treaties, however, are going to have some punitive, aka punishing, aspects to them. We're going to see the reparations being implemented. We also see that land will be forcibly taken away from most of these empires. And kind of actually, this land is not going to, well, some of it does go to places like France, but we do see that some of it is going to be carved up to make new independent states for European ethnicities. Kind of self-determination is going to happen for some European countries, as we will see. It's not going to really happen for the colonies like Woodrow Wilson sort of wanted, but it is going to happen in Europe, namely in Eastern Europe. Now, The most important treaty that comes out of the Paris Peace Conference is the one made between the Allies and Germany, aka the Treaty of Versailles. This was actually signed in Versailles. It was signed in the Hall of Mirrors specifically. That was that big place with a lot of mirrors. The kind of symbolic reason why it's done there, that's where France had to surrender to Germany. That's where Germany declared itself a unified constitutional monarchy back in the 1870s. Now, let's take a look at this treaty and take a look at some of the provisions. Well, first, we have to understand the new German government that made this treaty. In 1919, actually, we do see that Kaiser Wilhelm II, or it's a little bit earlier actually, that he abdicates, but he abdicates. What that means is he just LOL nopes and peace out from the throne. Germany then is going to transition into becoming a republic, actually. The Weimar Republic is what it's referred to as sometimes. And we'll talk about the fate of the Weimar Republic a little bit more in future chapters. But Germany is a democratic republic at this point, and kind of we're going to see that the decision to sign the Treaty of Versailles by this democratic government is not going to be the most popular thing among some certain circles among German nationalists. Now, as we'll see later, this treaty is going to be rather unpopular towards Germans. Now, what exactly is contained in the treaty? Well, the goal of the Treaty of Versailles is primarily representing the French and the British ideas, namely of weakening Germany economically and politically. Some of the things that are included in the Treaty of Versailles include the disarmament of the Rhineland. We do see that that demilitarized zone is set up between Germany and France. We're going to see that the military sizes in general are forced to decrease. Germany's not allowed to have an air force, for example, and it can have a very, very, very small military, extremely small navy as well. But the other thing, and all of this sounds like it's going to benefit the British and the French the most, that's because it does. Wilson compromised on everything. The only thing that he gets actually passed in the Paris Peace Conferences is the League of Nations. Now, one of the things that Germany has to do after World War I is pay reparations to the Allies, namely the French and the British. Now, Germans are going to characterize this as being a completely unjust thing. Honestly, it wasn't that bad, all things considered, but, well, it's too much in the face of nationalists. We're going to see that Germany's colonies in Africa and Asia, they're not granted independence like Woodrow Wilson wanted, but rather they are just handed over to the French, the British, and over in East Asia and the Pacific Ocean, they're handed over to the Japanese as well. But probably the most controversial, and honestly, in my opinion, the most petty part of the Treaty of Versailles is going to be the guilt clause. Basically, Germany has to accept blame for causing all of World War One, which is a little ridiculous. We saw that the Serbians and the Austrians and the Russians, arguably they're the ones that sort of bubbled up and caused this war, but the British and the French, again, their main enemy in World War One was the Germans. They lost the most to the Germans. The Germans did all the bad stuff, basically. Now, visually, let's take a look at the territorial losses as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, namely with the map of Germany right here and of Germany's colonies in Africa. Ignore all the stuff in the Middle East for now, because we'll talk about that later. Anyway, kind of Germany is forced to give up land. Some of this land is going to be used to build up new independent states like Czechoslovakia right here and Poland over here, all the bits in red. And conveniently, they're going to let Prussia, this area right here, still belong to Germany, even though there's a big gap right here. This is going to become the free city of Danzig, actually, or Gdansk if you're Polish. Anyway, we see that European borders are redrawn. Parts of land go to Denmark, parts of land go to the French, for example. This is Alsace-Lorraine, which I mentioned back in our first chapter, actually. But we also see the kind of colonies in Africa as well. All of these numbers right here, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all of these were German colonies in Africa. They're handed over either to the British, the French, or in the case of Namibia right here, German Southwest Africa, to the independent country of South Africa, which is a British Commonwealth nation. Now, we're going to see that all of this land being taken by the Germans is viewed by some nationalists especially, as being way too harsh on and victimizing on not victimizing, way too mean, basically, for the Germans themselves. And kind of this perception that the treaty was unjust, unfair for the Germans, it is going to lead to a rise of German nationalism, something we'll talk about more in our seventh chapter when we discuss the rise of fascism in Germany in the 1930s. Now, I don't know why the bullet point thing didn't work here, but let's take a look at kind of what else is happening outside of just our discussion of Germany. Now, the treaty that is signed with Austria-Hungary doesn't really matter for our purposes, but what does matter is understanding how, after the war, there are going to be some territorial changes with regard to implementing self-determination for different ethnic groups within Russia and the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Well, with the defeat of Austria-Hungary, we can see in the second map on the top right here that there is a lot of territorial changes. We see the rise of new places like Czechoslovakia. We see Austria and Hungary, obviously. We see kind of more land being given to Romania. We see that Poland gets to become a country now. We get to see the creation of some place called Yugoslavia. We'll talk about that more in a second. Remember, the Austria-Hungary Empire was divided between a lot of different ethnicities who honestly didn't like being governed by the Austrians. The Hungarians had a sort of special relationship where they were in the government of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they didn't like being kind of second fiddle, so to say, to the Austrians. So all of these places they get their independence will be. Now, Russia's a little bit of a different story. Russia, we saw in our second chapter, had to pull out of the war pretty quickly and not pretty quickly, but earlier than the rest of the Allies because of the Russian Revolution. And kind of to end the war with the Germans and the Austrians, we unfortunately saw that Russia had to sign what was known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This treaty right here is going to essentially lead to Russia having to give up its territory to the Germans and the Austrians. Now, once Germany is defeated, we don't see Russia getting those lands back, but rather we see that that land is going to be carved up and made into further independent territories like Poland, like Lithuania, like Latvia, like Lithuania. Wait, I think I said Lithuania twice, but whatever. So let's take a look at these new states. Well, kind of in line with that idea of pan-Slavism, we see the creation of what is known as Yugoslavia. Basically, these are all the southern Slavic countries, places like Slovenia, all the way down to Macedonia. They're all made into one super mega country where they each have kind of different regional federal states, kind of these republics, excuse me, like kind of like state governments in the United States, more or less. They do adopt a system of federalism, but it's all kind of held together with sticks and glue, as we are, or not sticks and glue, gum and glue, as we're going to see later on at the end of our class. The Baltic states, places like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, or not Poland, but those places are independent. Poland is independent for now. Czechoslovakia is independent for now. And I guess for now, for all of them, quite frankly. Now, this is another map just to kind of visualize what's going on right here. We see that Russia is losing its territory. We see that Germany's losing its territory, Austria, etc. But there's new independent countries. Finland's a place now. For now, well, actually, no, they kind of preserve their independence by allying with the Nazis. More on that later. Anyway, well, actually, no, I don't think we talk about that later, but it happens. Anyway, what about the Ottoman Empire, though? Honestly, this matters more than what our discussion of Austria and Russia. Well, the Ottoman Empire, remember, was also a central power, but the way that it was kind of defeated was largely through kind of what the British and the French were doing in supporting independence movements. However, there's a lot of kind of mixed promises that the British and the French are making to themselves and also to the Arabs and Jewish populations of the world. For one thing, kind of as you might remember from the previous chapter, I almost said the Soviet Union. That's not true. The British and the French, they supported both Arab independence movements. They were kind of promising guys like King Faisal, the Hashemite kingdom, the Hashemite kind of family. They were promising these independent Arab states, this pan-Arab state that would make up most of the Middle East, places like Saudi Arabia, places like modern-day Palestine, Israel area, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, all of that would have been one Arab kingdom. However, the Jews were also promised a state in the Middle East in this area of Palestine, kind of that idea of Zionism. And the United States wanted the British and the French to follow through on these promises. However, as we saw in the previous chapter, the British and the French had no intentions of actually following through on these promises. They wanted to kind of create a direct French and British area of control. They wanted to create areas under French and British influence, so there'd be kind of spheres of influence being carved up in the Middle East. They wanted an international zone in the area of Palestine, Israel. However, kind of word of the Sykes-Picot Agreement is going to get out, like because of the Russian Revolution, kind of the Russian Soviets, the communists, they are going to lease out or release this information that this secret treaty was signed, and it alienates Jews and Arabs from the Allies. So after the war, they are going to kind of create a system of, well, kind of compromising between the Sykes-Picot Agreement and actually giving self-determination for Arabs and Jews. That compromise is going to be known as the mandate system. Now, the mandate system doesn't just apply to the Middle East, it applies to kind of all of the Central Powers. And I say all the Central Powers, I mean the Germans and the Ottomans. Now, kind of under the mandate system, Ottoman territory in the Middle East and German territory in Africa and Asia, this is going to kind of be given over to the League of Nations, given over to member countries in the League of Nations. And kind of what would happen is that they would be placed under the protection, under the guidance, under the administration of a League of Nations country. And what would happen is that they would be in charge of transitioning that colony towards independence, towards self-determination. Now, in practice, they don't intend to do this whatsoever. They kind of just keep them as colonies and just say that they're mandates. Now, in the Middle East specifically, kind of that's the one that we want to focus on the most. We are going to see that the French, they are going to gain control over Lebanon and Syria, and the British not only gain control over Iraq, but over this area known as the Mandate of Palestine. Now, actually, kind of the intention for the British is to transition this Mandate of Palestine into, well, to fund divided up between Transjordan over in the west, or in the east rather, and then Palestine in the in the west. Sorry, kind of these two areas would be separated up basically, and kind of the area of Palestine that would be kind of entrusted to Jewish groups, and then the area of Transjordan that would be trusted towards Arab groups. However, kind of giving the area of Palestine more kind of Jewish presence is going to anger Palestinian Arabs, these Arabs that had gained a kind of regional sense of identity throughout the Ottoman Empire period, way back in the 1200s, 1299 period. And we'll talk about kind of the unfortunate conflict that will result once we see the end of World War II, and eventually Jewish groups in Palestine are going to declare independence for Israel. However, kind of, what about the area of modern day Turkey? What happened to them towards the end of World War One? Well, kind of, the area of Anatolia, the area of modern day Turkey, was also going to be divided up based on the mandate system. The Greeks, the Italians, the British, the French, all of these groups, they would kind of gain a foothold in the area of the former Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans would be sort of reduced to this area right here, where modern day Ankara is, the current capital of Turkey. However, kind of this area of occupations under the Allies is going to be met with a lot of Turkish resistance. And in particular, let's talk about the Turkish War for Independence. Well, the Turkish War for Independence is actually going to be originally commanded and led by the Ottoman Sultan. However, the Ottoman Sultan, the last Ottoman Sultan actually, is going to entrust this war for independence with a very special general in the Ottoman military, this guy right here, Mustafa Kemal. He is going to be given the title Ataturk, and we'll see why that is in a second. Well, Kemal is going to lead this independence war. He is successful at beating the weakened allies, and the allies kind of say, brother, it's too much work to handle. We don't really care about the Turkish area because that doesn't have enough oil. We mostly want Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Palestine. So do whatever the heck you want. Eventually, there's going to be a peace agreement signed, and we do see that the Ottomans are going to, well, regain a lot of their territory in Anatolia. They kind of take up the modern day borders of Turkey. However, eventually, as time goes on, Kemal is actually going to realize that who got them in this horrible situation where Turkey is such a smaller country? It was the Sultan, it was the Islamic leadership. So we do see eventually Kemal is going to not just kick out the allies, he overthrows the Sultan and officially declares Turkey as the independent republic of Turkey. Now, the big thing to associate with Kemal, kind of his nationalism, but also he's very secular as well. He views the Islamic ulama, who were in kind of key government positions in the Ottoman Empire, as betraying the Ottoman Empire, of leading to their destruction in World War II, or World War One rather. So he is going to say, no more of that. No more king, no more Islam as a major force in the government of the Ottoman Empire or excuse me, of the former Ottoman Empire, now the independent Republic of Turkey. Now, Ataturk is going to be actually given this name, this title of Ataturk, because it means father of the Turks, basically. He's sort of the George Washington-esque figure of modern day Turkey. And he is going to lead Turkey into sort of a golden age in a way. Turkey is going to become a lot more modernized in its economy and its industry. It's going to adopt a constitution, and it sticks to its constitution. It's not going to be the most liberal state in terms of democracy being a consistent thing in Turkey. There are periods of authoritarianism, but for the most part, it is a liberal republic, one that actually is going to be a leader in the Middle East of women's rights. Eventually, Turkey grants women the right to vote by 1930, and that's a huge development in Middle Eastern history. Now, what are some of the problems with the Paris Peace Agreement? Well, for one thing, kind of nationalists in the places that were defeated by World War One are, or that were defeated in World War One are going to view the terms of the Paris Peace Agreement as way too harsh. And you can see that in these Nazi era propaganda pictures, actually. For example, kind of a specific mentality that forms among German nationalists even immediately after World War One, not even in the 1930s, but as soon as as soon as the Treaty of Versailles is signed between the Weimar Republic and the Allies. Well, kind of what emerges is this idea known as the stab in the back myth. Basically, kind of it's a myth among nationalists that our democratic leaders betrayed the German nation and gave up all of our former territory. Kind of, we do see that it really is this language of, oh, we would have won the war. We would have actually kept going if these German Jewish people, if these communists, if these socialists, if they didn't make us sign the Treaty of Versailles. And you can see kind of this mentality right here in the political cartoon. We've got the politicians. They're going to stab our brave boys in the trenches by betraying them and giving up control to the allies. And who's behind the allies, or excuse me, behind these betraying politicians? This Nazi cartoon is going to say it's the Jews. Germans, think about this right here. This kind of poster right here says Sieg über Versailles. That means victory over the provisions of the Versailles Agreement. That doesn't say all of that, but that's kind of what it basically means. Germany, your colonies, look, your former colonial possessions are handed over to these aggressive other European powers. The Nazis, if you vote for them, they'll defend Germany and break the Treaty of Versailles. Your victory, hold on. This would have been our victory. All right. We are also going to see that another major problem with the Treaty of Versailles and the other peace agreements is that, honestly, there's nothing really to enforce demilitarization. There's nothing to enforce kind of the end of global tensions between member countries. And we are going to see that this League of Nations is based on mutual cooperation that never actually happens. Kind of a very famous example of this, even before kind of World War One, is going to be the fact that America just kind of nopes out from the international scene. We're going to see that the 1920s for the United States is a period of isolation, and actually, the United States never joins the League of Nations. Despite Wilson like doing everything he can to have the League of Nations be implemented at the Paris Peace Conference, ultimately, Congress back home in the United States never formally ratifies the Treaty of Versailles. The United States makes a separate peace agreement with Germany, one that does not have reparations, for one thing, but also doesn't require America to join the League of Nations. Kind of America is concerned about getting us into another world war. We didn't stay that long in World War One, honestly. We didn't lose that many soldiers, all things considered. But the horrors of the war and the idea and the cost of the war, namely, was going to be something that alienated us from entanglements with foreign countries. So that mutual defense pact that America, Britain, and France signed kind of during the Paris Peace Conference, it never actually follows through. America just LOL nopes out of it. And because of that, kind of we do see that the other allied powers are going to also not have the same strong commitments to each other as they did during World War One. But the major problem with the League of Nations is that it has nothing to enforce its ideas. The only thing the League of Nations is good at is famine relief and refugee relocation. It's not really effective at actually telling its member countries what to do. Germany, stop. No, don't remilitarize the Rhineland. No, Italy, don't invade Ethiopia. No, Japan, don't invade northern China. No, stop. Don't do that. That's basically the League of Nations reaction to a lot of the developments we'll talk about in the 1930s and eventually World War II. But another major problem is kind of the lack of self-determination for Africa and Asia. Before I get to that, though, kind of if America did join the League of Nations, maybe World War II wouldn't have happened. Maybe there would have been a stronger commitment to actually enforcing the ideas of the League and peace in the post-war period. But anyway, getting back to Africa and Asia, there was no real self-determination. Kind of the mandate system didn't grant independence. It merely kind of said, yeah, we'll give you independence when? Later on, sometime in the future, it doesn't matter. So the mandate system kind of it continues imperialism in a way. It just kind of flowers up the language a little bit different. And kind of the lack of independence for these mandate countries in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, but even the countries in the colonies that are still owned by the British and the French, these places were also promised self-determination. We're going to see that the failure to follow through on that is going to lead to nationalist independence movements that we'll talk about in Unit 8 of this class. All right. Well, that's it, actually. There was no discussion questions because obviously we're not here to discuss. What I want you to do for the rest of class is you are allowed to, and you can tell Mr. Grimes that I said this. You can go back to the video and say, hey, Mr. Grimes, Mr. Antarski says it's fine. You're allowed to work on homework for any other class. You're allowed to work on the cover page for this class. You're allowed to do those things. All right. I hope you have a great weekend. I will see you on Monday if you're coming in for test corrections. I will see you on Tuesday for class where we'll begin talking about the Russian Revolution. All right. Have a beautiful, blessed day, folks. Did you see Claude? Claude, he sort of butted his head occasionally, and I was petting him occasionally. The reason why the camera was shifting around a lot was because he was butting his head up against the video or against the computer. All right. The reason why I'm stalling is that I cannot find the stop recording button. All right, stop share. Oh, here we go. And oh no. Oh, there it is. All right. Bye-bye.